Greetings, my fellow knights. Tonight we will feel what it was like to hunt the mighty mammoth with stone spears, to wake on the edge of the ice, to track the herds across endless plains, and to face the moment when courage and survival meet in the cold morning air. And if you enjoy these journeys, you can help our circle grow by liking and subscribing. In the comments, share what other time or place you would like us to experience together. Now grip your spear and steady your breath. The hunt begins. Our story begins on the grasslands near the great ice sheets, where bands of hunters lived in hide shelters and followed the herds through seasons of cold and thaw. Imagine waking 13,000 years ago as a young hunter, lying on packed earth beneath stretched aurochs hide, the air sharp with frost even in early summer. The camp stirred before dawn, when smoke from dung fires drifted low across the ground and mixed with the smell of yesterday's cooking fat. Families lived in clusters of shelters, each one braced with mammoth ribs or salvaged wood from the river valley. The nearest ice wall stood 3 days' walk to the north, a wall of blue-white that caught the morning light and sent cold wind across the plain. But the grassland itself stretched wide and green, dotted with sage and low juniper, and the herds that grazed there kept the camp alive through winter and summer alike. The rhythm of life here turned with the animals, and every person old enough to walk understood that survival meant reading the land, knowing when to move, and trusting the hunters who went ahead with stone-tipped spears. The shelter held the warmth of bodies and the faint smell of hides cured with smoke and fat. Sleeping furs piled near the center kept off the worst of the night cold, and the fire pit outside sent thin trails of heat through gaps in the covering. Cale, the older brother, sat near the entrance already, working a piece of flint against a grooved stone to sharpen the edge of a blade. His hands moved with the steady patience that came from years of practice, each strike sending small chips onto the ground beside his knee. The sound of flint on stone mixed with the low voices of women preparing morning meal, the crackle of fire being fed with dried dung, and the shuffle of children being wrapped in cloaks before stepping outside. No one rushed in the early hours, but no one rested long either. Work began as soon as light touched the camp, and the day's tasks layered one upon the next until darkness returned and the fires were banked for the night. Breakfast came from a clay pot set near the coals, a thick porridge made from ground seeds and yesterday's marrow bones. The taste was plain but filling, and the warmth settled into the chest and hands after a cold night. Families ate together, sitting cross-legged on hides or standing near the fire, talking in low tones about the weather and the movements of game. Someone mentioned fresh tracks near the river bend, and another voice spoke of clouds building to the west. These conversations carried practical weight, each observation adding to the shared knowledge that kept the camp safe and fed. Children watched the adults and copied their movements, learning without being taught in words how to hold a bowl, how to tend a fire, how to listen when the hunters spoke. The camp lived as a single body, every person a part of the whole, and the work of survival belonged to everyone. After the meal, Cale brought out the spears and laid them across a flat stone for inspection. Each spear stood taller than a man, the shaft carved from young ash and hardened over fire until the wood lost its softness. The flint points were lashed to the wood with strips of wet sinew that dried tight and strong, and the edges had been worked until they could slice through hide without breaking. One spear showed a crack near the binding, and Cale set it aside to be repaired before the next hunt. He tested each point with his thumb, checking for chips or dullness, and when he found one that needed work, he sat down with his flint tools and began the careful process of retouching the edge. The work required patience and focus, and mistakes could ruin a good piece of stone. A hunter's life depended on the quality of his tools, and no one carried a weapon they had not checked and tested themselves. The camp lay in a natural hollow where the grassland dipped toward a tributary of the main river, a location chosen for its access to water and its shelter from the worst winds. Shelters clustered together in a loose circle, their entrances facing inward toward the communal fire pit where the largest gatherings took place. Beyond the camp, the land rolled in gentle waves, covered in grasses that grew knee-high by midsummer and turned gold in the autumn cold. Herds of bison grazed to the east, their dark shapes visible against the pale green of the plain, and smaller game, hares and ground birds, moved through the sage. The river ran shallow and clear over rounded stones, cold enough to numb the hands even in warm weather, and fish darted in the pools where the current slowed. It was a good place to live, rich in game and plants, and the camp had returned to this spot for 3 summers running. Preparation for a mammoth hunt did not happen in a single day. It began with watching the herds, tracking their movements across the plain, and waiting for the right conditions when the animals came near enough and the weather held steady. Scouts went out each morning, sometimes alone and sometimes in pairs, and they returned with reports of what they had seen. The herds followed routes worn deep into the earth over generations, paths that curved around wetlands and climbed toward high ground where the wind kept the insects down. When the time came to move, the whole camp shifted with purpose, and the hunters prepared their weapons while the women packed tools and supplies for butchering and transport. No one spoke of the danger in plain terms, but everyone understood that a mammoth could kill with a sweep of its trunk or a charge of its massive weight. The hunt required coordination, nerve, and the willingness to risk injury for the sake of meat that could feed the camp for weeks. Cale finished checking the last spear and stood, testing its balance with a few slow practice thrusts. The motion was smooth and controlled, the weight of the stone point pulling the shaft downward in a steady arc. He nodded, satisfied, and leaned the spear against the shelter wall beside the others. Around the camp, other hunters were doing the same, working alone or in quiet pairs, their movements unhurried but deliberate. A man named Aaron, older and steady-voiced, walked between the shelters, speaking with each group, sharing what the scouts had reported, and discussing where the herds were likely to move in the coming days. His words carried weight, and people listened when he spoke. Leadership in the camp did not come from shouting or force, but from experience and the trust others placed in a person's judgment. Aaron had led hunts for many seasons, and his calm presence brought confidence even when the work ahead seemed uncertain. The sun climbed higher, warming the air and drawing moisture from the grass in thin trails of mist. Birds called from the scrub, and somewhere in the distance a herd moved, the sound of hooves faint but steady. The camp settled into the rhythm of midday work, some people mending hides or grinding pigment for trade, others gathering firewood from the sparse groves downriver. Children played near the water under the watch of grandmothers, their laughter carrying across the open ground. Life moved in layers here, each task woven into the next, and the knowledge that the hunt was coming did not stop the daily work from continuing. There would be time to rest after the kill, time to celebrate and share the meat and tell the story of how it happened. But first came the preparation, the careful tending of tools and the quiet focus that every hunter carried into the field. By evening, the spears stood ready. The camp had been supplied with enough firewood and water to last several days, and the hunters gathered near the central fire to hear Aaron speak about the plan. He described the terrain where the herds had been sighted, the position of the cliffs, and the roles each person would take when the time came to move. The fire crackled and sent sparks upward into the cooling air, and the faces around the circle showed focus and calm. No one asked unnecessary questions, and no one boasted about what they would do. The work of the hunt was shared, and every person understood that success depended on cooperation and discipline. When the talk ended, the camp settled into quiet, and the night came down clear and cold, filled with stars that stretched across the sky in bright clusters. Tomorrow the scouts would go out again, and when the herds moved into position, the hunters would follow. The morning after Cale helped sharpen the last spear. The trackers gathered near the edge of camp where the grass grew tall and bent eastward in the wind. Aaron stood among them, a man whose face carried lines from squinting into distance, and he motioned for the younger hunters to follow. The group moved in single file down the slope toward the river valley, where water ran cold and clear over smooth stones. Walking felt easy, in the cool air, and the sound of boots on dry earth created a rhythm that matched breathing. No one spoke much during these walks, because the land itself had things to say if a person knew how to listen. The trackers paused often, crouching low to examine the ground or touching the grass to test which way it had been pushed. It was teaching without words, and learning came through watching the same gestures repeated until they made sense. The river valley spread wide and green, bordered on both sides by low hills that rolled toward the horizon like frozen waves. Mammoth trails crossed this landscape, the way deer paths crossed smaller meadows, except these trails were broad enough for 3 people to walk side by side. The prints themselves pressed deep into soft clay near the water, each one as wide as a man's chest and marked with the curve of thick toes. Aaron knelt beside a fresh track and ran his hand along the rim where mud had been pushed up and dried in ridges. He glanced back and nodded, not needing to explain that this print was recent, made perhaps the day before when the clay was still wet from rain. The smell of crushed sage rose sharp and bitter from the ground where heavy feet had trampled the low bushes. That scent clung to the air and marked the trail as clearly as the prints themselves. Following the trail meant reading more than footprints. Mammoth herds left behind a pattern of damage and disturbance that stretched across the valley like a map drawn in broken stems and scattered dung. Where they had fed, the grass was cropped short and littered with fragments of uprooted plants. Where they had rested, the ground was packed flat and stained dark. Dung piles sat in heaps along the trail, some still steaming in the morning cold, others dried into fibrous mounds that crumbled when touched. Ortard stopped beside one of the older piles and broke it apart with a stick, showing how the undigested grass inside revealed what the animals had been eating and how long ago they had passed. The details accumulated slowly, each small observation adding to a larger picture of where the herd was going and how fast it moved. Learning this kind of reading took seasons, not days, and mistakes were common at first. The group moved deeper into the valley, following the trail where it turned north along the riverbank. Birds called from the willows that grew thick near the water, and the sound of wings cutting through air came sudden and startling when a flock rose all at once. The trail climbed a gentle rise, and from the top the valley opened into a wider plain where the grass grew sparse and pale. Aaron paused here, shielding his eyes against the bright sky, and pointed toward a line of trees in the distance. Mammoths often moved toward water and shelter, he explained in his slow and careful way, and the trees marked a place where a spring fed a shallow pool. Knowing where the animals would go next mattered as much as knowing where they had been. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of cold stone and distant ice, and everyone stood quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of the open land pressing against them. By midday, the group had circled back toward a different section of the valley, where the clay was softer and the tracks were easier to read. A comrade walking ahead stopped suddenly and called the others forward, crouching beside a set of prints that overlapped in a confused tangle. Aaron studied them closely, tracing each outline with his finger and counting the different sizes. The prints told a story, a small herd, perhaps 5 or 6 animals, including at least one calf whose tracks were narrower and shorter than the others. The calf's presence meant the herd would move more slowly and stay closer to cover. It also meant the adults would be more protective, more dangerous if approached carelessly. Aaron said nothing about danger, but his expression carried the reminder. The group moved on, following the overlapping trail toward a stand of trees where the mammoths had paused to strip bark and leaves from the lower branches. The trees stood damaged and scarred, their bark torn away in long strips that hung loose or lay scattered on the ground. Fresh sap gleamed sticky and amber where the wood was exposed, and the smell of it mixed with the sharper scent of broken branches. Mammoths fed on bark when grass was scarce, using their trunks to grip and pull until whole sections came free. The feeding site showed how long the herd had lingered, because more damage meant more time spent in one place. Aaron walked the perimeter of the site, noting how the trails led away in 3 directions before converging again farther north. Herds sometimes split and rejoined as they moved, he said, depending on the terrain and the availability of food. Understanding these patterns meant understanding the rhythm of their lives, the way they responded to the changing seasons and the pressure of the ice that crept closer each winter. Returning to camp took most of the afternoon, and the walk felt longer after hours of careful study and slow movement. The sun dropped lower in the west, painting the grass gold and stretching shadows long across the valley. Feet ached from walking, and legs felt heavy with the kind of tiredness that came from steady effort rather than hard work. The camp appeared first as a thin line of smoke rising above the hills, and then as the familiar shapes of shelters clustered near the dung fires. People were busy with their usual tasks, scraping hides, sharpening tools, tending children, and the smell of cooking meat drifted warm and inviting through the cool air. The trackers dispersed quietly, each one returning to his own fire and his own family. There was no ceremony to mark the end of the day's work, no announcement of what had been learned. Knowledge gathered slowly, shared through gesture and repetition, and stored away for the days when it would matter most. That evening, sitting near the fire with the others, The day's observations settled into memory as stories began to circulate. Someone mentioned seeing wolf tracks near the river, and someone else spoke of finding a cluster of old bones half buried in the clay. These fragments of information wove together into a broader understanding of the valley and the life it supported. Mammoth hunting was not a single act of courage or skill. It was the culmination of many days spent learning the land and reading the signs. The herds moved through this valley every autumn, following routes their ancestors had traveled for generations, and the hunters followed them with the same patient attention. Success depended on knowing where the animals would be, how they would respond to pressure, and where the terrain offered the best advantage. Failure came from impatience, from acting too soon or misreading the signs. The fire crackled and sparked, sending bright embers drifting upward into the darkening sky. Night settled over the camp with the quiet hum of conversation and the occasional cry of a child being soothed to sleep. The stars emerged cold and bright, scattered thick across the blackness, and the wind carried the smell of distant rain. Tomorrow the trackers would walk the valley again, watching for changes in the trail and waiting for the right moment to gather the hunters. The mammoths were close now, perhaps only a day or two ahead, and the signs pointed toward the northern cliffs where the land rose steep and rocky. Everything learned during these patient days of walking and watching would soon be tested, but for now rest came easily, and sleep arrived with the comforting knowledge that the land had revealed its secrets one more time. The fire burned low, and the camp fell into the steady rhythm of breathing and silence. The grass stood taller than a man's waist that morning, dry stalks clicking together when the wind pushed through from the north. Aaron had led the hunting party out before dawn, moving in a loose line across the valley floor where the trackers had marked fresh trails the day before. The ground rose gently toward a ridge crowned with scattered juniper, and the hunters spread wide as they climbed, keeping low enough that their heads stayed below the grass line. Each man carried his spear loosely, point angled down to avoid catching the shaft on vegetation. The air tasted cold and clean, carrying no scent yet of the animals they hoped to find. Walking quiet meant placing each foot deliberately, rolling from heel to toe, testing the ground before committing full weight. The rhythm came naturally after years of practice, learned first as a child trailing behind older hunters. The ridge offered a view across miles of open country, broken only by dark lines of willow marking seasonal streams. Aaron raised one hand and the line stopped, men crouching in place while he studied the land ahead. Shadows still pooled in the low places where morning sun had not yet reached, and mist hung thin over a marshy area near the western edge of the valley. Nothing moved at first. Then one of the hunters beside Aaron pointed toward a dark mass near the marsh, too large and solid to be stone or shadow. The shape shifted slightly, and another appeared beside it, then another. The herd stood half a mile distant, barely visible through the morning haze. Aaron turned and gestured the hunters down flat, and everyone dropped to their bellies in the grass. The stems smelled sharp and dusty, pressed against faces while men waited for the next signal. Lying still gave time to study the distant shapes as sunlight strengthened and details emerged from the gloom. The mammoths moved slowly through the marsh grass, their dark backs rising like hills above the vegetation. Even at this distance, their size felt wrong somehow, too massive to be real animals rather than features of the landscape itself. A calf walked close beside one of the larger females, its trunk lifting occasionally to touch her side. The herd numbered perhaps 20 individuals, scattered across several hundred paces of boggy ground where they fed on sedges and pulled up roots with their trunks. Watching them felt like observing a piece of the world that existed outside normal time. Creatures so old and established they seemed woven into the valley itself. The wind shifted slightly, blowing from the hunters toward the herd, and Aaron hissed a warning. Everyone pressed lower, barely breathing. Aaron began moving forward on his belly, using elbows and knees to crawl through the grass without raising his silhouette above the stalks. The others followed in a ragged line, spacing themselves an arm's length apart. Progress came slowly, measured in body lengths rather than paces, each movement deliberate and soundless. The spear became awkward to manage while crawling, its length catching on stems and roots, requiring constant adjustment to keep the stone point from dragging in the dirt. Sweat gathered despite the cool air, trickling down ribs and soaking into leather clothing. The mammoth herd remained unaware, still feeding peacefully in the marsh. A bull lifted his great tusks to strip bark from a willow, the crack of breaking wood carrying clearly across the distance. The sound made several hunters freeze momentarily before continuing their slow approach. Grass seeds stuck to palms and forearms, itching but impossible to brush away without creating motion the animals might notice. The hunters reached a slight depression where runoff had carved a shallow channel during spring melt, its banks offering cover barely deep enough to crouch behind while staying hidden. Aaron gathered the men close, speaking in whispers that barely carried past the nearest listener. He pointed to positions along both sides of the herd's current location, indicating where groups should move to cut off escape routes. The plan relied on patience rather than speed, positioning hunters to turn the mammoths toward terrain that offered advantage rather than trying to chase animals that could easily outrun men across open ground. 3 hunters would circle wide to the north, another 4 would work around to the south, while Aaron and the remaining men would wait in the center. The timing had to be precise, everyone in position before anyone made a sound or showed themselves. One hunter produced a small leather pouch and passed it among the group, each man marking his face with a streak of red ochre mixed with fat. The gesture felt both practical and ritual, preparation that steadied nerves. The flanking group split off quietly, crawling away through the grass in opposite directions, while the center group settled down to wait. Time passed slowly, with nothing to do but watch the herd and count breaths. The mammoths continued feeding, occasionally rumbling to each other in voices so deep they seemed to travel through the ground rather than the air. A raven flew overhead, circling twice before moving on toward the ice sheets. The sun climbed higher, warming the back of the neck and shoulders, making leather clothing feel stiff and constricting. Small black flies appeared, drawn by the smell of unwashed bodies and the ochre paste, landing on exposed skin and requiring slow, careful movements to brush away without creating sudden motion. The waiting felt harder than the crawling had been, tension building in shoulders and thighs from holding still in an awkward crouch. Aaron remained completely motionless, watching the herd and occasionally glancing toward the positions where the flanking groups should be reaching their assigned places. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the grass behind the hunters, 3 clear notes that hung in the morning air. Aaron's head turned slightly at the sound, recognizing it as a signal rather than a genuine bird. A few moments later, another call came from the opposite direction, different in pitch but similar in pattern. Both flanking groups had reached position. Aaron let out a long, slow breath and picked up his spear, checking the binding that held the stone point to the shaft. The other hunters did the same, fingers testing knots and cordage, making sure everything sat secure and ready. The mammoth herd continued grazing, unaware that men now surrounded them on 3 sides. The lead cow raised her trunk, testing the air, but the wind still blew from the wrong direction to carry human scent. She returned to feeding after a moment, pulling up a clump of marsh grass and shaking dirt from the roots before curling it into her mouth. Aaron rose slowly to his feet, keeping the spear low and angled across his body. The other hunters in the center group stood as well, forming a line barely visible above the grass. For a long moment, nothing happened, men and mammoths occupying the same valley in strange suspended stillness. Then Aaron raised his spear overhead and shouted, a wordless call that carried sharp and sudden across the open ground. The other hunters took up the cry, voices overlapping into a wall of sound designed to startle rather than threaten. The effect on the herd was immediate and electric. The lead cow trumpeted and wheeled away from the noise, her massive body turning with surprising speed. The other mammoths followed her lead, bunching together as they began to move. The calf stumbled, caught between following its mother and staying near the other adults, its thin squeal adding to the sudden chaos. The hunters in the center advanced at a walk, maintaining the noise, driving the herd away from their position. The mammoths moved northeast at first, a shuffling run that made the ground tremble underfoot. Then the northern flanking group appeared from the grass, shouting and waving hides, and the herd veered south. The southern group rose in turn, blocking that direction, and the lead cow turned again, this time angling east toward higher ground beyond the marsh. The hunters followed at a measured pace, not running but walking steadily, keeping pressure on the herd without pushing so hard the animals panicked into a full stampede. The coordination felt fragile, dependent on each group reading the movements of the others and responding in rhythm. Aaron kept his group moving forward, stepping carefully through the marsh where water soaked into boot leather and cold mud sucked at each footfall. The mammoths were moving in the right direction now, heading toward the cliff face that waited beyond the eastern ridge. Everything depended on maintaining that trajectory, keeping the herd moving forward until the trap became inescapable. The morning air tasted of dust and trampled grass as the line of hunters spread wide across the valley floor. Aaron had positioned everyone before dawn, marking each station with a stack of stones, while the sky shifted from black to gray. The plan required timing that could not be spoken aloud once the herd moved. Each hunter carried bundled hides tied to long poles, and beside them lay piles of dry brush that would create smoke when lit. The distance between stations measured roughly 30 paces, close enough to see the next hunter's signals but far enough to cover the breadth of the valley. A light wind pushed from the south, carrying scent away from the mammoths that grazed somewhere beyond the low ridge ahead. The waiting stretched long enough for legs to stiffen and hands to grow cold around the wooden poles. The first mammoth appeared as a dark shape against the pale grass, then another, then 7 more, moving in a loose cluster toward the waterhole near the valley's western edge. The lead cow walked with her trunk swinging low, testing the ground for roots or tubers worth pausing to dig. 2 younger adults flanked her on either side, and behind them came 3 juveniles that still carried reddish fur along their shoulders. The herd moved without urgency, stopping often to pull up mouthfuls of sedge or scratch against weathered boulders. From the hiding place in the tall grass, the sound of their breathing carried clearly across the open ground, deep and rhythmic like wind moving through a cave. Mika crouched somewhere on the far ridge near the cliff face, invisible but positioned to block the northern route if the herd turned that direction. Aaron raised his right arm, then swept it forward in a motion that had been practiced for days before the hunt began. The signal passed from hunter to hunter down the southern line, each repeating the gesture until it reached the farthest station near the rocky outcrop. The first bundles of brush caught fire quickly, sending up columns of pale smoke that rose straight in the still morning air. The sound began as voices calling out in rough shouts, accompanied by the slapping of hides against wooden poles that created sharp cracks echoing off the valley walls. The noise was not constant, but came in waves, timed to push without causing the herd to scatter in panic. The lead cow lifted her head immediately, trunk raised to test the air, while her massive ears flared wide. For a moment she stood frozen, and the entire herd stopped with her. Then the herd began to move, not in flight, but in a coordinated shift away from the smoke and noise that now rose along their southern flank. The lead cow turned toward the northeast, her body angled away from the burning brush, and the others followed in a tightening group. The pace remained steady, almost casual, but their direction had changed. The hunters on the southern line advanced slowly, keeping the smoke and sound between themselves and the mammoths, pushing without rushing. One juvenile broke slightly to the west, testing for an escape route, but a hunter there stepped forward with his hide bundle raised high, and the young mammoth turned back toward the group. The air filled with the smell of smoke mixed with the sharper scent of mammoth dung crushed underfoot. Every step brought the herd closer to the rock face where Mika and 4 others waited in positions marked days earlier. The dust rose thick as the herd picked up speed, responding to the pressure from behind without breaking into full flight. Their feet struck the ground in a rhythm that could be felt through the earth, a steady drumming that grew louder as they moved. The lead cow swung her head from side to side, searching for an opening in the line of noise and smoke that now curved around her like a closing hand. The hunters moved faster too, closing gaps and keeping the arc tight enough to channel the herd, but loose enough to prevent panic. Sweat ran down backs despite the cool morning air, and throats grew raw from shouting. A comrade nearby stumbled on uneven ground but recovered quickly, raising his pole again without breaking the rhythm of sound. The mammoth's breathing had changed, coming faster and deeper, and the white vapor from their trunks hung in the air behind them like scattered clouds. The rock face came into view as the valley narrowed, a wall of grey stone rising 30 feet above the grassland with a steep talus slope at its base. The ground there was littered with broken rock and old bones from previous hunts, a place where the earth had been worn smooth by generations of use. Mika stepped into view at the northern edge of the cliff, his hide bundle raised high, and the lead cow veered sharply away from him. The turn brought the herd directly toward the rock face, their path now committed. The hunters behind pressed harder, their shouts growing louder and more urgent, while those on the flanks closed inward to prevent any sideways escape. The sound of hooves against stone mixed with the bellowing calls of the mammoths as they realized the trap. One of the younger adults tried to turn back, but the mass of bodies behind pushed her forward. The air smelled of crushed sage and the sharp mineral scent of disturbed earth. The lead cow reached the base of the cliff and tried to climb the talus slope, her massive weight sending loose stones cascading downward. Her hind legs scrambled for purchase on the unstable surface, while her front feet dug into the rock. For a moment it seemed she might succeed, her powerful shoulders driving upward against the incline, but the slope was too steep and the stones too loose, and she slid backward into the press of bodies behind her. The other mammoths bunched together at the base of the cliff, their movements frantic now as they searched for escape. The hunters circled closer, maintaining the wall of noise but no longer advancing. The goal was containment, not injury, keeping the herd trapped against the rock until exhaustion made them vulnerable. One mammoth broke free to the east, but two hunters moved to cut her off, and she turned back toward the group rather than face them alone. The standoff lasted through the middle of the morning, the herd gradually wearing down against the unyielding stone and the persistent pressure of human voices. The mammoths' calls became less frequent, their movements slower and less coordinated. The lead cow finally stopped trying to climb and stood with her sides heaving, her trunk hanging low toward the ground. The others pressed close around her, forming a defensive cluster with the juveniles in the center. This was the moment that required patience rather than action, waiting for the animals to tire completely before attempting the final approach. The hunters lowered their poles but kept their positions, their own breathing heavy and their muscles burning from the long chase. The dust began to settle, revealing the churned earth and the scattered stones where the herd had tried and failed to find an escape route. When the first mammoth finally collapsed from exhaustion, the others remained standing around her in a protective circle, but their resistance had ended. The hunters moved forward slowly with spears ready, approaching the fallen animal with the respect due to creatures that had fought so hard to survive. The work that came next would be measured and careful, no different in its way from the patient tracking that had led to this moment. The sun had climbed higher, warming the valley floor and casting long shadows from the cliff face across the trampled ground. In the stillness that followed the noise and dust, the sound of the river could be heard again in the distance, flowing as it always had, regardless of what happened along its banks. The mammoth lay on its side at the base of the cliff, breathing in great heaving gasps that sent clouds of vapor into the cold air. The ground around the animal had turned to churned mud mixed with patches of blood where the fall had opened wounds along its flank and shoulder. Dust still hung in the air from the chase, settling slowly onto the grass and rocks. The other mammoths had thundered away to the east, their calls growing fainter as distance swallowed them. Aaron stood 20 paces back with his spear raised, watching the fallen cow's trunk curl and uncurl against the ground. The animal's eye rolled white with fear, and its tusks scraped shallow furrows in the dirt as it tried to lift its massive head. The smell of crushed sage mixed with the sharp scent of blood and the animal's dung. Mika moved forward from the rocks where the ambush party had waited, his spear held low and steady as he approached the mammoth's hindquarters. The others spread out in a loose arc, keeping clear of the tusks and the thrashing trunk. The cow tried to push herself upright, front legs scrabbling against the slope, but her rear leg hung at a wrong angle from the fall. Her bellowing echoed off the cliff face, a sound that carried across the valley and sent birds scattering from the cottonwoods by the river. Kale stood to the left with his throwing stick ready, and a hunter named Soren moved to the right, carrying a heavy stone-tipped lance. The group worked without shouting now, each person holding position while the animal's movements slowed from exhaustion and shock. The first spear went in behind the shoulder, driven hard by Mika's full weight as he lunged forward and then stepped quickly back. The mammoth lurched and swung her trunk toward him, but the blow fell short and struck only air. Dark blood welled around the embedded shaft. Aaron circled toward the head, keeping his eyes on the tusks, and thrust his own spear into the thick muscle of the neck. The wooden shaft bent but held as he leaned into it, then pulled it free for another strike. The animal's breathing turned ragged and wet. Each exhalation sprayed red mist into the grass. The sound of it was steady and rhythmic, like wind through a narrow canyon, and the hunters moved in time with those breaths. Kale handed his spear forward, and the shaft passed from his hands to those of a hunter crouched near the animal's ribs. The stone point went in deep between two ribs, angled downward toward the vital organs the trackers had described around countless evening fires. The mammoth shuddered, her trunk sweeping the ground in a wide arc that knocked loose stones clattering down the slope. Soren drove his lance into the same spot Mika had opened, pushing the point deeper with short, controlled thrusts. Blood ran in thick streams now, soaking into the dry earth and pooling in the low places where hooves had pressed the ground flat. The cow's bellowing faded to a low moan, then to labored breathing that seemed to shake her entire body. The hunters stepped back and waited, watching the animal's sides rise and fall. The mammoth's eye began to glaze, the pupil wide and dark as the light behind it dimmed. Her breathing slowed to long, shuddering gasps, separated by silence that stretched longer each time. The trunk lay still now, curled against the ground like a length of old leather. Aaron knelt at a safe distance and placed his hand flat on the earth, feeling the vibrations of the animal's heartbeat transmitted through stone and soil. The rhythm faltered, skipped, then settled into something faint and uneven. Mika stood with his bloodied spear resting against his shoulder, watching the cow's ribs expand one final time and then go still. The only sound was wind moving through the grass and the distant calls of ravens already circling overhead. The animal had died without thrashing or further struggle, and the valley felt suddenly quiet after the noise of the chase. Blood steamed where it met cold air, rising in thin wisps that twisted and vanished. The scent was heavy and metallic, mixing with the smell of torn earth and the mammoth's hide still warm from running. Kale approached slowly and placed one hand on the animal's shoulder, feeling the coarse hair and the thickness of skin beneath. The mammoth's bulk made the hunters look small, even with 8 of them standing around the body. Her tusks curved up from the ground, each one longer than a grown man was tall, yellowed and grooved from years of stripping bark and digging through snow. Mika walked the length of the body, checking for movement, then nodded to the others. The killing was finished, and the long work of butchering would begin as soon as the women arrived with cutting tools and baskets. Aaron pulled his spear free from the mammoth's neck, the stone point slick with blood that ran down the shaft and onto his hands. He wiped the weapon clean on a patch of dry grass, then checked the binding where sinew held the point to wood. The binding had held through the impact, but one strand had begun to fray and would need replacing before the next hunt. Soren retrieved his lance and did the same, working the point loose with a twisting motion and inspecting the edge for chips or cracks. The stone had survived intact. Around the animal's body, hunters gathered their weapons and stood in small groups, speaking quietly among themselves. Some drank from water skins, others simply sat on nearby rocks and let their breathing return to normal after the long chase and the quick violence of the kill. The sun had climbed higher during the hunt, and now it warmed the backs of necks and cast short shadows on the ground. Flies had already begun to gather on the blood-soaked earth, buzzing in lazy circles before settling to feed. The ravens called from the cottonwoods, waiting for the humans to finish their work so they could move in and claim the scraps. Kale watched one bird hop along a low branch, its head cocked to the side as it studied the scene below. In the distance, thin columns of smoke rose from the camp where fires still burned, and children played, and elders waited for news of the hunt. The walk back would take most of the day, and the butchering would take longer still, but the hardest part had ended. The mammoth would feed the camp through the coming cold, and its bones and tusks would be shaped into tools that lasted for seasons. Mika knelt beside the mammoth's head and placed both hands on the ground in a gesture the old hunters had taught him. He spoke no words aloud, but his lips moved slightly as he offered thanks in the manner of his people. The others stood quiet and still, letting him finish before they began the bloody work ahead. When he rose and stepped back, Aaron signaled toward the river where the women were already moving up the valley with their cutting blades and copper pots. The group would work through the afternoon and into evening, stripping away hide and fat and meat until the skeleton lay exposed beneath the sky. The work would be slow and careful, each cut deliberate, each portion claimed and carried. For now the hunters rested in the grass and felt the wind dry the sweat on their skin, while the mammoth's body cooled beside them. The mammoth lay on its side like a small hill covered in shaggy brown fur. Steam rose from the wound where the spear had gone in, wisps of white vapor that climbed into the cold morning air and disappeared. The hunters stood around the carcass in a loose circle, breathing hard and saying nothing for a long moment. Someone laid a hand on the thick hide near the shoulder, feeling the warmth still trapped beneath the coarse hair. The work ahead would take days, maybe longer, and everyone knew it without speaking. The smell of blood mixed with the dusty scent of crushed grass where the animal had fallen. No one rushed forward. There was a kind of stillness that came after the kill, a pause that felt necessary before the labor began. Kale crouched near the hindquarters with a heavy stone blade in his hand, studying the layers of hide and fat. He pressed the edge against the mammoth's flank and began the first long cut, working downward in a steady line. The hide was thicker than anything else anyone had worked with, dense and tough, even where the blade was sharpest. Blood welled up along the incision, but did not pour out. The body had already begun to cool in the wind. Others moved in with their own tools, blades of flint napped thin and sharp, handles wrapped in sinew to give a better grip. The sound of cutting was rhythmic and deliberate, a scraping rasp that carried across the grassland. No one spoke much except to point or gesture toward the next section that needed opening. The hide came away in sections, peeled back carefully to preserve as much of the surface as possible. Beneath it lay a thick layer of fat, pale yellow and dense, clinging to the muscle underneath. Lena and two others from the camp had arrived with copper pots and leather sacks, ready to collect what could be rendered. The fat would burn longer and cleaner than wood, and it could be mixed with ground ochre to make waterproofing for seams and joints. Someone sliced through a portion near the ribs and lifted a chunk the size of a man's torso, carrying it toward the fire that had been built a short distance away. The smell of it melting was rich and heavy, coating the back of the throat. Flies had begun to gather despite the cold, buzzing in tight circles over the exposed meat. The muscle beneath the fat was dark red, dense and fibrous, striped with pale connective tissue. Cutting through it required patience and force in equal measure. The stone blades dulled quickly against bone and tendon, and hunters paused every so often to resharpen the edges by striking them carefully with a heavier stone. Flakes of flint fell into the grass like tiny arrowheads. Aaron worked near the front legs, carving around the massive shoulder joint to free sections of meat that could be carried. Each piece was laid on a stretch of hide spread flat on the ground, kept clean of dirt and grass. The ribs were more difficult, curved and close together, with strips of muscle running between them that had to be worked loose carefully. Someone made a joke about a rib breaking a blade last season, and a few others smiled without stopping their work. By midday, the fire near the carcass had grown into a steady blaze, fed with dried grass and branches hauled from the river valley. Copper pots sat balanced on flat stones at the edge of the flames, fat bubbling inside them with a low hiss. Lena stirred one of the pots with a long wooden paddle, skimming foam from the surface and pouring the clarified fat into leather bags that had been softened with smoke. The rendered fat would keep through the winter if stored properly, and it was one of the most valuable parts of the kill. The heat from the fire felt good against the cold wind that swept down from the ice in the north. Hunters rotated in and out of the work, some stepping back to warm their hands while others took their place at the carcass. The rhythm of the day settled into something steady and almost calm. The internal organs were handled with particular care. The stomach was enormous, a heavy sack filled with partially digested grasses that had to be emptied away from the meat. The liver and heart were carried immediately to the fire, sliced thin and roasted on flat stones until the edges curled and darkened. These parts did not keep long and were meant to be eaten fresh. The taste was strong and slightly bitter, but filling in a way that made the cold feel less sharp. Tam took portions of the organ meat and set them aside, wrapped in clean hide, to be carried back to the elders who had stayed at camp. The intestines were rinsed in a shallow pool of water nearby, then coiled and packed for later use as cord or storage. Nothing was wasted. Even the bones would be split for marrow once the butchering was finished. The tusks required different tools and a different kind of patience. They curved out from the skull in long arcs, stained brown near the base and pale ivory toward the tips. Someone wedged a heavy stone beneath one tusk and struck it carefully with a hammerstone, working to loosen the root from the bone socket. The ivory was dense and valuable, useful for carving tools, toggles, and beads that could be traded with bands from the southern hills. It took most of an hour to free the first tusk, and when it finally came loose, it was heavier than expected. Two hunters lifted it together and carried it to the pile of materials set aside from the meat. The skull itself would be left behind, too massive to carry. Though someone suggested taking the jawbone for its shape, the decision was left for later, when the rest of the work was done. Night came before the butchering was finished. Fires were built in a loose ring around the carcass, close enough to provide light and warmth, but far enough to keep sparks away from the meat. Hunters took turns sleeping and working, keeping the fires fed and the blades moving. The smell of blood and fat and smoke hung thick in the air, a scent that carried for a long distance across the open grassland. Wolves called from somewhere in the darkness, their voices high and distant, but they did not come close. The fires and the number of people were enough to keep them away. Someone sang quietly near one of the flames, a rhythm without words that matched the scrape of stone on hide. The stars overhead were sharp and cold, and the work continued through the hours until dawn. By the second morning, most of the usable meat had been carved away and packed into bundles wrapped in sections of hide. The bones lay exposed in the grass, white and massive, already beginning to dry in the wind. A few hunters stayed behind to finish the work, while others prepared to carry the first loads back toward camp. The weight of the bundled meat was significant, and the straps would dig into shoulders before the day was out. Cale wiped his blade clean on a patch of grass and tucked it into his belt, his hands stiff and aching from 2 days of cutting. The mammoth that had moved across the horizon like a piece of the world itself now lay reduced to pieces, sorted and ready to sustain the band through the cold months ahead. The work had been hard, but it was finished. The long walk home was next. The first load was heaviest. Bundles of meat lay wrapped in sections of hide, each one tied with twisted sinew that cut into your palms as you lifted. Cale helped lash 2 bundles to a pole that rested across your shoulders, the wood biting through the leather pad someone had folded there. The weight settled like a stone pressing down through your spine. Around the kill site, others bent to their own loads, working in pairs to distribute the burden evenly. Mika checked each binding with careful hands, tugging the knots to be sure they would hold. The smell of raw flesh filled the cold air, sharp and metallic. No one spoke much. There was only the work of lifting, adjusting, testing balance before the long walk began. When the pole finally sat right across your back, you took a breath and felt your legs absorb the strain, then took the first step toward home. The ground stretched out in frozen waves ahead, hard soil broken by patches of ice that glinted under the pale sun. Walking with weight changed everything. Each step had to be planned, the foot placed flat to avoid slipping on frost-slick stones. The man ahead of you moved steadily, his own pole swaying slightly with each stride. Behind, someone grunted as their load shifted, and the line paused while they reset the binding. The cold worked its way through your boots, numbing your toes, but the effort of carrying kept your chest warm. Sweat formed under your tunic despite the chill. The landscape rolled on without much change, just open grassland dotted with low shrubs and the occasional dark shape of a boulder. No landmarks yet, just the rhythm of walking and the creak of leather straps. It felt strange to move so slowly across ground you had covered quickly on the way out. By midday, the sun hung low and pale, offering little warmth. The group stopped near a cluster of rocks that broke the wind. Everyone lowered their loads carefully, leaning the poles against the stones and sitting heavily on the frozen ground. Hands were checked for blisters. Someone passed around a water skin, and the liquid was cold enough to ache in your throat. Cale sat beside you, flexing his fingers and blowing on them. His face was red from the wind, and he said nothing, just stared back the way you had come. The kill site was out of view now, hidden by the curve of the land. Aaron walked among the hunters, looking at feet and shoulders, asking quiet questions. One man had a strap that had worn through. Lena pulled a length of sinew from her pack and rebound it with quick, sure movements. The rest was brief. The meat had to reach camp before dark the next day. The afternoon brought harder ground, and a wind that pushed from the side, making balance tricky. Dust rose in thin streams across the open plain, stinging your eyes and coating your lips with grit. The pole dug deeper into your shoulder despite the padding, and you shifted it slightly, trying to find a spot that hurt less. It never really worked. Pain became a constant companion, dull and throbbing, something to breathe through rather than fight. The loads swayed with every step, and keeping them steady took focus. A comrade to your left stumbled on a hidden root, and his pole slipped. dragging him sideways until the man behind steadied him. They adjusted the weight and kept moving. No one could afford to stop for long. Wolves had been seen in this stretch of land the season before, and though none appeared now, the thought of them stayed in everyone's mind. The group tightened its spacing without needing to be told. Evening came slowly, the light turning grey and cold. The line of hunters reached a shallow depression where a frozen stream cut through the grassland. Ice covered the water in thick sheets, cracked in places where the current still moved beneath. Aaron called a halt and pointed to a spot where the bank was flat and sheltered by a low ridge. Camp would be made here. The loads were set down with groans of relief, and everyone moved stiffly, muscles locked from hours of carrying. Cale helped you lower the pole, and the sudden absence of weight felt almost dizzying. Your shoulders burned, and you rolled them carefully, feeling the knots of tension shift. Firewood was scarce, but dried dung had been carried for this purpose. Lena and another woman built a small fire in a ring of stones. The flames caught slowly, smoking at first, then settling into a steady glow that pushed back the gathering dark. Meat was roasted on sticks over the fire, just enough to fill bellies and keep strength up. The smell was rich and familiar, a comfort after the long day. Everyone sat close to the flames, hands stretched toward the warmth. Conversation was sparse and practical. Talk of tomorrow's path, the condition of the loads, the weather. Someone mentioned seeing fresh tracks near the stream, large paw prints that might have been a cave lion. Aaron nodded and said watches would be set through the night. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the black sky. Stars appeared overhead, sharp and cold. Wrapped in hides and huddled near the heat, the group settled into a wary rest. Sleep came in shallow stretches, broken by the sounds of the night and the knowledge that predators moved through the darkness beyond the firelight. Someone always sat awake, spear across their knees, eyes scanning the shadows. Dawn broke grey and quiet, the fire reduced to coals. Stiff limbs were stretched and joints cracked as people rose and prepared for the second day. The meat was checked, the bindings retied where they had loosened overnight. Frost covered everything, glittering on the grass and the bundled hides. Breath plumed in the air. The loads were lifted again, and the weight felt heavier now, muscles already sore from the day before. But home was closer. That thought steadied everyone as the march resumed. The path led upward slightly, climbing a long slope that gave a view of the land ahead. From the top you could see the distant smudge of smoke rising from the camp. It was still far but visible. Cale saw it too, and managed a tired smile. The sight gave strength. Feet moved faster despite the pain, and the line pressed on with renewed purpose. The final stretch crossed open ground where the wind had scrubbed the earth bare. Dust swirled around boots, and the cold bit harder here without the shelter of hills. The camp grew clearer as the distance closed. Dark shapes of tents, the glow of fires, small figures moving between them. Children spotted the returning hunters first, and ran out to meet them, their voices high and excited. The group did not break stride, but the presence of the young ones lifted spirits. Dogs barked and circled, sniffing at the bundles. As the line entered the camp, people emerged from their shelters, calling greetings and thanks. Tam was there, his weathered face breaking into a grin as he clapped Aaron on the shoulder. The loads were lowered in the center of camp, near the main fire, and the relief of setting them down was overwhelming. Your legs trembled, and you sat heavily on the ground, watching as others gathered to inspect the haul. The meat was safe, brought home through hard work and watchful travel. Hands reached out to help sort the bundles, to separate what needed immediate cooking from what could be stored. Lena moved among the women, organizing the work with calm efficiency. Fires were stoked higher, and the rich smell of roasting meat soon filled the camp. Cale sat beside you, his shoulder pressing against yours in quiet companionship. Neither of you spoke. There was no need. The work was done, and the proof lay in the piles of meat and hide that would feed and clothe the camp through the coming cold. Around you, the ordinary sounds of life resumed. Children playing, dogs gnawing on scraps, voices rising and falling in conversation. The hunt had been successful, and now the harder, quieter work of survival continued. Tomorrow there would be more to do, but for this moment, the weight was lifted and the journey complete. The camp came alive with voices as the last bundles of meat were laid near the central fire pit. Smoke rose thick and grey into the evening sky. carrying the smell of roasting fat that made mouths water even after 2 days of travel. Women who had stayed behind greeted the hunters with clasped hands and wide smiles, children running between the adults to touch the dark bundles wrapped in hide. Tam stood near the largest fire, his weathered face bright in the orange glow as he gestured for the hunters to gather round. The weight lifted from tired shoulders as leather straps were loosened and set aside. Around the camp, people moved with purpose but without rush, gathering stones to ring new fires and dragging logs closer for seating. The air felt warmer here than on the frozen plain, sheltered by low hills and filled with the comfort of familiar sounds. After days of watching the horizon for danger, it felt good to be surrounded by known faces and the hum of shared work. Tam raised both hands and the camp fell quiet. He spoke in the old way, thanking the mammoth for its strength and the land for holding it. His voice carried across the circle without shouting, each word measured and clear. He named the hunters who had driven the herd, then those who had made the kill, and finally those who had carried the meat home through cold and risk. Kale stood beside the fire, his face calm but tired, and when Tam spoke his name, the camp answered with a low hum of approval. The naming was not about pride, but about remembering who had done what, so that when the meat was divided, everyone would know the labor behind it. Tam did not mention himself, though he had been the one to choose the cliff and position the flankers. That was the way of it. The elder guided, but the group succeeded. When he finished speaking, he gestured toward the bundles, and the work of division began. The meat was unwrapped slowly, each bundle opened and inspected in the firelight. Tam used a smooth stone blade to separate portions, cutting through frozen flesh with careful strokes. He set aside the largest pieces for families with nursing mothers or elders too weak to hunt. The next cuts went to the hunters and their kin, then to those who had tended fires and prepared tools while the rest were gone. No one argued or reached forward. The system had been practiced for generations, older than anyone living could remember. A woman named Syra carried her family's portion to a smaller fire, her daughter trailing behind with a clay bowl. Another hunter, broad-shouldered and silent, accepted his share with a nod and moved away to where his woman waited, the smell of raw meat mixed with smoke and trampled grass. It was not a perfect division, but it was fair enough, and fairness mattered more than plenty when winter was always close. The first meat to roast was the richest thick slabs of fat marbled flesh speared on green wood and held over glowing coals. The fat hissed and dripped, feeding the flames until they leapt higher and cast flickering shadows across the camp. People gathered in clusters around the fires, sitting on hides or flat stones, watching the meat darken and char at the edges. Kale sat near one fire with Mika and 2 others, their faces streaked with soot and weariness. Someone passed a water skin made from a bladder, and each man drank before handing it along. No one spoke much. The work of the last days sat heavy in their bones, but the warmth of the fire and the promise of food loosened the tightness in their chests. A child laughed somewhere behind them, and the sound carried bright and clear through the cold air. It was a reminder that the hunt had not been only about survival, but about preserving the life that came after. When the meat was ready, it was pulled from the flames and divided again into smaller portions. The taste was overwhelming, rich and dense, with a char on the outside and tender warmth within. Grease ran down chins and fingers, wiped away on leather, or licked clean without shame. There was no ceremony to the eating, only hunger met with abundance. Tam cracked open a mammoth bone with a stone hammer, revealing pale marrow that steamed in the cold. He scooped it onto a flat stone and passed it to the elder woman beside him, then cracked another for the next person. The marrow was soft and fatty, melting on the tongue, and leaving a warmth that spread through the chest. It was the part of the animal most valued, given first to those who needed strength. Around the camp, people chewed slowly, savoring what they knew might not come again for many moons. The firelight softened their faces, and for a while the hardness of the hunt gave way to simple satisfaction. After the first hunger was answered, Tam rose and walked to a hide bundle set apart from the rest. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing smooth pieces of ivory carved from the mammoth's tusks during the butchering. Each piece was no larger than a hand, shaped into simple forms: a curve like a crescent moon, a disc with a hole bored through the center, a long, slender rod. These were not tools but gifts, marks of participation that would be carried or traded in the seasons ahead. Tam called forward the hunters one by one, pressing an ivory piece into each hand with a few quiet words. The objects were not decorated or polished, just cut and shaped enough to show intent. When Kale received his, he turned it over in his palm, feeling the weight and smoothness. It was a small thing, but it carried the memory of the hunt and the labor that followed. Others around the camp watched without envy. They knew their time would come when they stood in the line of hunters. The gifting continued beyond the hunters. Pung gave carved ivory to the women who had prepared tools before the hunt, and to the children old enough to have helped carry wood or tend fires. A boy no taller than Tam's waist received a small disc, his eyes wide as he clutched it to his chest and ran back to his mother. An older woman who had stitched the hide straps for the meat bundles was given a smooth rod, which she tucked into her belt without fuss. The giving was not grand or loud, but it wove the camp together, acknowledging that the Mammoth belonged to everyone who had played a part. Some pieces would be traded to distant camps in exchange for flint or ochre. Others would be kept as markers of kinship or memory. The ivory was not wealth in the way of hoarded grain or precious metal, but it was value made visible, a way of saying that effort had been seen and honored. As the night deepened, the fires burned lower, and the camp settled into quiet clusters. People spoke in low voices, retelling parts of the hunt or sharing observations about the herd's behavior. Kale sat with his back against a log, the ivory piece resting on his knee, and listened to an older hunter describe a mammoth drive from years before. The man's voice was calm and unhurried, his words painting a picture of a different cliff and a different season, but the same careful work. Around them, children curled up in furs near their parents, their bellies full and their faces peaceful. The smell of smoke and roasted meat clung to everything: hair, clothing, hands. It was a smell that would linger for days, a reminder of abundance, even as the work of preserving what remained still lay ahead. The stars appeared overhead, cold and distant, but the warmth of the fire and the presence of the group held back the night's chill. When the last of the meat was wrapped and stored, and the fires reduced to glowing coals, the camp began to drift towards sleep. Tam remained by the central fire, tending the embers with a long stick, ensuring they would hold until morning. A few others lingered nearby, unwilling to let go of the warmth or the companionship too quickly. The hunt was over, the feast complete, but the memory of it would shape the days ahead as the camp turned its focus to drying and preserving. There was still much to do before the meat would be safe from spoilage and the hide ready for use. But for now, the work could wait. The Mammoth had given what was needed, and the people had honored that gift with care and sharing. Tomorrow would bring its own tasks, steady and necessary, but tonight belonged to rest and the quiet satisfaction of survival renewed. The work began the morning after the feast, when the fire pits still held warm ash and the camp smelled of cooked fat and smoke. The great hide lay stretched across the ground near the largest shelter, staked down with wooden pegs driven through holes along its edges. Women and older children gathered around it with stone scrapers, settling into positions that would hold for hours. The sun climbed slowly over the grassland, warming skin that had grown cold in the night. Someone brought water in leather bags, and the scraping began with steady, rhythmic sounds that carried across the open ground. The work was quiet and familiar, the kind that filled days between hunts when hands stayed busy and minds wandered freely. The scraping removed every trace of fat and tissue from the underside of the hide, working in long strokes that followed the natural grain. Bits of membrane came away in pale strips, falling onto the dirt where dogs waited to carry them off. The stone tools were small and flat, worn smooth from years of use, shaped to fit comfortably in the palm. Lena worked near the center of the hide, her movements practiced and sure, pausing occasionally to test the surface with her fingertips. The leather had to be scraped thin enough to dry evenly, but thick enough to hold together through the coming winter. Beside her, a younger woman named Sella watched and copied each motion, learning the pressure and angle that made the work go smoothly. Strips of meat hung on wooden racks built near the camp's eastern edge, where the wind blew steady and dry. The racks stood taller than a man, made from young trees lashed together with sinew and rawhide cord. Thin slices of mammoth meat draped over horizontal poles, dark red turning gradually to brown as moisture left the surface. Flies gathered in the warmth of midday, and someone kept a small fire burning beneath the racks to produce smoke that drove the insects away. The smell of wood smoke and drying meat filled the air, mixing with the scent of crushed grass and distant sage. Cal stood watch over the racks in the afternoon, turning pieces that dried unevenly and checking for any signs of spoilage. The fat had been rendered days earlier, melted slowly in shallow stone bowls set beside fires that burned with steady, controlled heat. Now it sat in leather bags, thick and white, stored in the cool earth beneath the main shelter. Some of it would be mixed with dried berries and pounded meat to make cakes that lasted through the coldest months, food that could be carried long distances without spoiling. The rest would be used for waterproofing hides, treating wooden tools, and feeding lamps during the winter darkness. Nothing went unused. Even the smallest pieces of sinew were saved, stretched and dried for binding and sewing. The camp moved with the rhythm of preservation, each task leading naturally to the next. Bones lay sorted in piles near the butchering site, cleaned of meat and marrow, waiting to be worked into tools and ornaments. The long bones would become awls and needles, scrapers and wedges. The ribs might be shaped into runners for small sleds or bent into frames for summer shelters. Tam sat among the bones in the late afternoon, examining each piece and setting aside those with the straightest grain or the best shape. A comrade worked beside him, using a hammerstone to split a section of leg bone, revealing the dense interior that would polish to a smooth finish. The work required patience and a good eye, the ability to see finished tools inside rough material. Children watched from a distance, collecting bone fragments for their own small projects. The tusks had been carried back to camp, wrapped in wet hides to keep them from cracking in the dry air. Now they rested in the shade of the largest shelter, still massive and curved, their surfaces yellowed with age and wear. Carving ivory was careful work, done in winter when there was time to sit for hours without moving. But even now, someone marked the tusks with charcoal, planning where cuts would be made and what shapes might emerge. Small pieces could become beads and toggles, gaming pieces and ceremonial figures. Larger sections might be worked into bracelet blanks or spear straighteners. The ivory was hard and dense, resistant to splitting, a material that held fine detail and lasted longer than stone. Evening came with the sound of scraping and the quiet talk of people working side by side. The hide was nearly finished, its underside pale and even, ready for the next stage of tanning that would make it soft and durable. Lena stood and stretched, rolling her shoulders to ease the stiffness that came from hours of bending. Others followed, washing their hands in a wooden bowl and moving toward the fire where food waited. The meal was simple that night, dried meat from an earlier hunt and roots baked in the coals eaten without ceremony. The great feast had passed, but the mammoth still fed the camp, its presence felt in every bundle of meat and every section of hide. The last light faded over the grassland, turning the western sky orange and then deep blue. The drying racks stood dark against the horizon, their loads swaying slightly in the evening breeze. Smoke rose from the banked fires, drifting low across the ground before lifting and disappearing into the cooling air. Someone added wood to the central fire, and flames climbed higher, casting long shadows that moved across the camp. The work of preservation was not finished. Days more would pass before all the meat had dried and the hide had been properly tanned. But the rhythm was established now, familiar and steady, the kind of work that connected one season to the next. The night settled quietly around the camp, the stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky. The smell of smoke and dried meat had become part of the air itself, as constant as the wind. Tomorrow would bring more scraping, more turning of meat on the racks, more sorting and cleaning and careful storage. The mammoth that had walked the grassland weeks before now existed in pieces, transformed into food and tools and warmth for the winter ahead. The hunt was complete, but its meaning continued in the steady work of hands that knew how to make survival from what the land provided. The fire burned low, and the camp rested, ready for whatever the next day would ask. Snow came early that year, dusting the grasslands white before the last of the meat had been stored away. The camp settled into the rhythm of cold months, when days grew short and the work moved inside the shelters. The great mammoth hide now stretched across wooden poles above the central fire pit, cured and scraped until it gleamed like dark leather in the firelight. Beneath it, families gathered in the evenings, close enough to share warmth, but each tending their own tasks. The smell of tanned hide mixed with wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of fat rendering in clay bowls. Outside, wind whistled through the valley, carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin. But inside, wrapped in furs with the fire crackling low, the cold felt distant. The hunt had become part of the past, something spoken of in quiet voices, as hands worked bone and sinew into tools that would last through spring. Kale worked beside the fire most mornings, shaping mammoth ivory into blade handles and toggles for clothing. He used a flint burin to score grooves along the curved surface, then snapped pieces free with careful pressure. The ivory took time to work, harder than antler, but smoother when finished. He taught the method to younger hunters who watched from across the fire, showing how to angle the tool so it bit without shattering the piece. One boy named Jaw tried 3 times before getting a clean cut, his face tight with concentration. Kale said nothing, only nodded when the ivory finally split true. Around them, other hands carved beads and toggles, small things that would be traded when the clans gathered in spring. The work filled the daylight hours and left little time for restlessness. By midday, fingers ached from the repetitive motion, but the pile of finished pieces grew steadily near the shelter wall. Lena and the other women spent those weeks preparing hides for clothing and repair. They worked in a circle near the fire, scraping the inner surface of deer and bison skins with rounded stone tools. The motion was steady and practiced, each stroke pulling away bits of membrane and fat until the hide turned pale and supple. When a skin was clean, it went into a wooden frame where it could be stretched and softened with a mixture of brain tissue and water. The process took days, and the camp smelled of wet leather and the sharp tang of tanning agents. Children played nearby, building small structures from sticks and bits of bone, their laughter rising above the scrape of tools. Occasionally, one of the women would pause to adjust a frame or add wood to the fire, but the work continued without much conversation. There was comfort in the repetition, in knowing that each finished hide meant warmer clothing when the wind turned bitter in the deepest part of winter. The stores from the mammoth hunt lasted longer than expected. Tam had divided the meat carefully, giving each family enough to stretch through the lean months if they used it wisely. Dried strips hung from the rafters inside every shelter, dark and hard as wood. When boiled with roots and wild onions, they softened into something close to fresh meat, rich and filling. Fat had been rendered and stored in sealed bladders used sparingly to flavor stews or rubbed into tools to keep them from cracking in the cold. The tusks and larger bones had been set aside for trade, but smaller pieces were already being shaped into needles and awls. Nothing from the animal went to waste. Even the coarse hair had been woven into cord, strong enough to bind stone to wood or lash together shelter poles. On nights when the wind howled through the valley, the knowledge of those stores brought a quiet kind of ease. Hunger would come eventually, as it always did in late winter, but for now the camp had enough. Some evenings, when the fire burned low and the youngest children had fallen asleep in their furs, the older hunters spoke of the hunt. They did not boast or exaggerate, but recounted details in the flat tone of men remembering work that had gone well. Aaron described the moment the lead cow turned toward the cliff, how her eyes had rolled white and her trunk had lifted as if testing the air for danger. Mika spoke of the sound the animal made when it fell, a deep bellow that echoed off the rock face and silenced the birds in the nearby trees. The stories were not meant to entertain, but to preserve. Younger hunters listened closely, memorizing the small decisions that had kept the group safe: where to stand when the herd broke into a run, how to read the lead animal's body to predict which way it might turn, when to close in and when to hold back. These lessons could not be learned from watching alone. They had to be spoken aloud, passed from one generation to the next, so that the knowledge survived even after the men who carried it were gone. The winter also brought visitors from smaller camps scattered along the river. They arrived in pairs or small groups carrying bundles of fur and baskets of dried berries to trade. They stayed a night or two, sharing the fire and swapping news of game movements and weather patterns farther north. One man brought word that the ice sheets had crept forward again that year, covering valleys that had been open the previous spring. Another spoke of a herd of horses seen moving west, away from the frozen ground. These stories shaped the group's plans for the months ahead. If the ice continued to advance, the camp would need to move south before the next winter. If game grew scarce in the usual hunting grounds, the trackers would need to range farther to find it. The visitors left with strips of mammoth meat and small bone carvings, gifts that strengthened the loose network of alliances that kept the scattered groups connected. When they departed, the camp felt smaller again, but the information they carried would ripple outward, shaping decisions in camps the group would never see. By midwinter, the routine had worn grooves into daily life. Wake before dawn to stoke the fire, chew a strip of dried meat while the water heated, work until the light faded, then gather near the flames to eat and mend tools. The monotony was broken only by small events. A child's first successful throw with a practice spear, a hide finished and ready to be sewn into a tunic, a section of roof repaired before the next snowfall. These moments passed without ceremony, noted only in the steady accumulation of completed tasks. The camp did not celebrate survival, it simply continued, one day folding into the next. Outside, the land lay frozen and silent under a sky that seemed to stretch forever. Inside, hands stayed busy and voices stayed low. There was no urgency, no crisis to solve. Just the quiet persistence of people who understood that survival was not a single victory, but a long series of small, deliberate actions. As the days began to lengthen again, barely noticeable at first, thoughts turned towards spring. The meat stores were lower now, but still sufficient. The hides had been transformed into clothing and shelter repairs. The ivory and bone tools filled baskets near the back of each shelter, ready to be used or traded when the clans gathered. The hunt had provided more than food. It had carried the group through the hardest season, and the memory of it lingered in every tool and every meal. Kale spoke sometimes of the next hunt, wondering aloud if the herds would return to the same valley, or if the group would need to travel farther to find them. No one answered with certainty. The mammoth moved according to rhythms the group could observe but never fully predict. All they could do was watch the land, read the signs, and move when the time felt right. That was the pattern, repeated each year, that kept them alive. The fire burned low as the last of the evening's work was set aside. Outside, stars filled the sky, cold and bright above the frozen grasslands. The shelters creaked in the wind, but inside they were warm enough. The hunt was over, the meat stored, the winter half past. What came next would unfold in its own time, shaped by weather and game and the slow turning of seasons. For now, there was only this: the quiet crackle of embers, the steady breathing of sleepers wrapped in furs, and the knowledge that the group had done what needed doing. The mammoth had been taken, butchered, and made to last. And when spring arrived, they would rise again, walk the valley, and search the horizon for the next herd. That was the way it had always been. That was the way it would continue, as long as the land allowed, and the people remembered how to read its signs. And so, our hunt comes to an end. The fire crackles, the air grows still, and the herd drifts back into the mist of memory. Until our next story together, rest well, dream deep, and good night.